Welcome to the lands of science fiction stories. I wish you a pleasant listening experience.
That's it? That's how you defend yourselves? The question hung in the air, heavy with disbelief. Commander Cale Varen of the Helix Vanguard, a towering figure with pale blue skin and a physique sculpted by countless battles, couldn't mask his surprise. He and his squad of elite warriors stood in a half circle, exchanging uneasy glances with their alien counterparts, their glowing eyes betraying their confusion. Across the room, Captain Eric Draven remained calm, a slight smirk playing on his lips as he watched the reactions unfold. He was human, tall and lean, dressed in the standard-issue combat gear of the United Terran Fleet. His posture was relaxed, in stark contrast to the tension thickening the air among the Helix soldiers. "That's enough to stop an attack?" Vareen demanded, his voice rising slightly as he gestured to the inert form of one of his warriors, still recovering from a demonstration. Arik nodded, stepping forward. "In certain situations, yes. Leverage, timing, precision, they matter more than brute strength alone." He motioned for another warrior to come forward. "Let me show you again." A Helix named Saren, known for his size and sheer power, hesitated before stepping forward. He towered over Arik, muscles bulging beneath his silver armor. Eric motioned with his hand. "Grab me, like you're attacking in combat." Saren's hesitation faded as he lunged forward, his massive arms aiming to lock around Arik's torso. With a fluid motion, Arik sidestepped, his hand finding the warrior's wrist in a practiced sweep. Within moments, Saren was on the ground, gasping in pain as Arik applied a simple pressure to his arm, neutralizing the attack without breaking a sweat. The room was silent. No one moved. Varen narrowed his eyes, his pride as a commander boiling beneath the surface. "Simple tricks," he muttered. "This is nothing compared to real combat." Arik straightened, his expression calm but sharp. "You might call it a trick, but that's the point. It's not about overpowering your opponent. It's about surviving the moment. Strength without control is just noise." The Helix soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. Their species was known for its ferocity in battle, their size and strength often enough to overwhelm most foes. But this demonstration challenged everything they believed about warfare. "You expect us to believe this is enough in a real fight?" Varen's voice was filled with skepticism. Arik met his gaze steadily. "I'm not asking you to believe it. I'm asking you to experience it." He stepped back, spreading his arms wide. "You think brute force alone is enough to win battles. But the truth is, against someone faster, smarter, or more experienced, your strength won't save you." Varen clenched his jaw, unwilling to let the conversation end there. "Prove it," he growled. Arik's grin widened, his eyes gleaming with challenge. "All right, step forward, Commander." The soldiers around them shifted uneasily. Varan's reputation as an indomitable warrior preceded him. The idea of a mere human, a Deathworlder or not, bringing him down was unthinkable. Yet as Varan squared his shoulders and approached, there was a tension in the air that no one could ignore. Without warning, Varen lunged forward, faster than most would expect from someone of his size. His arms shot out to grab Arik, but the human was quicker. Arik ducked under the commander's arms, his movements fluid and deliberate. Before Varen could react, Arik had hooked one of his arms, twisting it at an awkward angle. With a subtle shift of weight, Varen was forced to his knees, his face contorted in discomfort. The room was silent, save for the ragged breathing of the commander. Eric stood above him, still applying the subtle pressure that kept Varen in place. "You see," Arik said quietly, "it's not about how much power you can throw at someone. It's about using the least amount of effort to get the maximum result." He released Varen, who staggered to his feet, rubbing his arm in disbelief. The Helix soldiers stood frozen, their expressions unreadable. They had always believed in their superiority in battle, their raw power enough to dominate any foe. Yet here, in this room, they had been shown something they never expected. Varen's pride was stung, but he couldn't deny what had just happened. He glanced at Arik, his eyes narrowing in thought. "You're saying all this leverage, precision, it's enough to win battles?" Arik nodded. "It's what keeps you alive. You fight smart, not hard. If you're just throwing punches and hoping your strength carries you through, you're going to lose. A murmur spread through the soldiers. They had come expecting a display of human savagery, the rumored ferocity of the Deathworlders who hailed from Earth. Instead, they had witnessed something entirely different, something that had shaken their confidence. Varen stood silent for a moment, his mind racing. He had never been bested so quickly, so easily. His warriors looked to him for guidance, for reassurance. Finally, he straightened, looking Arik in the eye. This isn't over, human. You've shown us something, but we need more. You need to prove that these techniques aren't just tricks, that they work when the enemy is trying to kill you. Arik's expression softened. I'll show you more if you're willing to learn. But remember this, it's not about who's stronger. It's about who's smarter. In real combat, survival means everything. Varen didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to his soldiers. Tomorrow, he announced, his voice hard, we'll see how well these techniques hold up in a real fight. Arik smiled faintly, already anticipating the challenge to come. He knew the Helocs weren't convinced yet, but they would be. The battle for their minds had only just begun. The training hall was filled with an electric tension the next morning. The Helocs soldiers filed in, their footsteps echoing ominously off the cold metal walls. There was no idle chatter, no casual glances. Each one of them had seen the demonstration yesterday, and it left them uneasy. Commander Varen was at the front, his eyes hard and determined. He had spent the night going over the events in his head, unable to shake the image of Arik Draven, effortlessly bringing him to his knees. Arik stood in the center of the room, arms crossed, waiting patiently. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, watching the movements of the soldiers as they entered. He could feel the hostility radiating off them, not in hatred, but in the desire to prove themselves, to challenge what they had witnessed. Today was going to be different. Varen stepped forward, his broad shoulders tense under the weight of his authority. He wasn't just here to fight, he was here to reclaim his command, to show his warriors that their way of battle, their reliance on brute strength, was the right way. No more demonstrations, Varen said, his voice a low growl. No more tricks. Show us what you do when someone's trying to kill you. Arik raised an eyebrow, unfazed by the challenge. Is that what you want? A real fight? Varen's lips curled into a thin smile. Yes, I want to see what happens when you face an enemy who's not interested in technique. I want to see if you can survive against someone who doesn't care about leverage or pressure points. Someone who just wants to tear you apart. Arik nodded slowly, stepping forward into the open space at the center of the hall. His movements were calm, controlled, and measured. He had been expecting this. All right, Arik said quietly, motioning to the group. You've got a lot of strong fighters here. Let's see how many of them it takes to bring me down. The soldiers exchanged glances, their glowing eyes filled with uncertainty. It wasn't arrogance that held them back. There was a very real fear beneath their bravado. They had seen Varen taken down in seconds yesterday, and while they wouldn't admit it aloud, they weren't eager to be next. Varen's expression hardened. Saren, get in here. Saren, the hulking Helocs warrior, who had been swiftly defeated the day before, stepped forward. His muscles rippled beneath his armor as he clenched his fists, the faint sound of grinding metal accompanying his every movement. I'm ready, Saren muttered, his voice thick with determination. Arik simply nodded, motioning for the rest of the soldiers to clear the area. The hall fell silent, the tension so thick it was nearly palpable. Saren wasted no time. He lunged at Arik, his massive arms swinging in wide, brutal arcs aimed at crushing his opponent. His speed, despite his size, was impressive, and any normal opponent would have been overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity of his attack. But Arik wasn't normal. He moved like a shadow, slipping past Saren's strikes with an effortless grace that made it seem as if he were barely exerting himself. His feet danced across the floor, always just out of reach, as he waited for the right moment. And then it came. Saren's frustration mounted with each missed blow, and in his haste to overpower Arik, he overextended his swing. It was a tiny mistake, one that most wouldn't notice in the heat of battle. But Arik did. In a single fluid motion, Arik sidestepped Saren's punch, locked his arm, and used the warrior's own momentum to flip him over. Saren hit the ground with a thunderous crash, the air leaving his lungs in a ragged gasp as he struggled to comprehend what had just happened. Arik didn't even break a sweat. He stood over the fallen warrior, his expression as calm as ever. "That's what happens when you rely on strength alone," Arik said quietly. "You leave yourself open. You get reckless." Varen's face darkened, but before he could speak, Arik turned toward him. "Next." Another Helok stepped forward, this one smaller but faster. Arik gestured for him to attack, and the result was the same. Arik moved with a practiced efficiency, using the Helok's speed against him. Within moments, the second soldier was on the ground, groaning in frustration. One after another, they came at him, and one after another, Arik took them down with minimal effort. He never used more strength than was necessary, always turning their aggression into their downfall. Each defeat left the room heavier with disbelief and frustration. By the time the seventh warrior had fallen, Varen's frustration had boiled over into fury. "Enough!" Varen shouted, stepping into the ring. His eyes blazed with anger. But there was something else there too, a trace of fear. "I won't let you humiliate my men any longer. You've made your point." Arik tilted his head, watching Varen with a quiet intensity. "I'm not trying to humiliate anyone, Commander. I'm trying to teach you something." "Fool." Varen clenched his fists. "We don't need your lessons." Arik's gaze hardened. "Yes, you do. Because right now you're all fighting like brutes. And in a real battle, that's what gets you killed." Varen's nostrils flared. But before he could retort, Arik stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "You think this is about showing off? About making you look weak? It's not. It's about survival. And if you don't start adapting, if you don't learn to think like a survivor instead of a soldier, then you and every one of your men will die the first time you face an enemy that's smarter than you." For a long moment, the room was deathly quiet. Varen stood motionless, the weight of Arik's words sinking in. His soldiers were watching him, waiting for his response. Finally, Varan exhaled, his shoulders slumping ever so slightly. "What do we need to do?" Arik's expression softened, but only slightly. "You need to learn to fight smarter, not harder. To use your strength when it matters, but not to rely on it. You need to understand that winning a fight isn't about overpowering your enemy. It's about outthinking them." Varen's pride was still there, simmering just beneath the surface, but he gave a reluctant nod. "Show us." Arik stepped back, surveying the group of tired, battered warriors before him. "All right. First, we start with control. It's not about how hard you can hit, it's about when and where you strike. Follow my lead." As he began to walk them through the basics of precision and leverage, the soldiers, still bruised and frustrated, started to realize that perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to battle than brute force. And as Varen watched, a grim determination settled over his face. He wasn't going to let Arik Draven be the only one who could wield such power. Tomorrow things would be different. The next morning arrived with a heavy stillness. The soldiers of the Helok's Vanguard gathered in the training hall, but this time the mood was different. Gone was the arrogance, the prideful posturing. In its place was a quiet resolve, a willingness to learn. Commander Varan stood at the head of his warriors, his usual confident demeanor tempered with a more serious edge. His gaze was fixed on Arik Draven, the human who had challenged everything they thought they knew about combat. Arik, as always, was calm, his posture relaxed but ready. Today was going to be the final test, and both he and the Heloks knew it. This was no longer about proving anything. This was about survival. Varen stepped forward, his expression grim but respectful. "We're ready," he said, his voice low. "Show us how to win." Arik nodded, motioning for Varen to stand in front of the others. "This isn't just about me showing you techniques anymore," Arik began, his tone serious. "You've seen what precision, control, and leverage can do. Now it's about applying them. You'll need to take everything I've shown you and make it your own." Varen's eyes narrowed, a flicker of determination crossing his features. "And if we fail," Arik shrugged, "then you die. That's what happens in real combat. There are no second chances." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. and the soldiers shifted uneasily. But there was no backing down now. They had come too far, learned too much. The Helocs weren't just strong, they were warriors. They had faced countless battles, but this was different. This was personal. Eric stepped into the center of the room, and this time he called for Varen alone. "Come at me with everything you have, Commander. Show me what you've learned." Varen didn't hesitate. He charged forward, his four arms moving with deadly precision, every strike aimed to incapacitate or kill. But this time, there was no reckless aggression. His movements were controlled, calculated, just as Arik had taught him. Arik moved with the same fluid grace as before, sidestepping and deflecting each blow. But he could tell. Varen had improved. The commander was faster, more precise, and he wasn't leaving himself as open as before. The two of them danced around each other, a blur of motion and technique, each testing the other's limits. Varan's strength was still a force to be reckoned with, but now it was tempered by the lessons he had learned. He wasn't just a brute anymore. He was thinking, adapting. Suddenly, Varan made a move that surprised Arik. He feinted with one arm, drawing Arik's attention just long enough for his other arm to strike. It was a subtle but effective tactic, and it caught Arik off guard. For the first time, Arik was forced to take a step back, his eyes narrowing in approval. "Good," Arik muttered. "You're learning." Varen didn't respond. He pressed the attack, his strikes coming faster and more coordinated. Arik could feel the shift in the fight. Varen wasn't just trying to overpower him anymore. He was using his size, his strength, and his intelligence to outmaneuver the human. This was no longer a one-sided fight. The two warriors clashed again, their movements a blur of calculated strikes and counters. Arik felt the strain in his muscles as Varen's strength pushed him to his limits, but he couldn't help but smile. Varen had become a true threat, a warrior who had learned to control his power. Then in a flash, Varen made his move. He feinted high with one arm, then swept low with another, aiming to take out Arik's legs. It was a well-executed maneuver, one that would have worked on most opponents. But Arik was ready. In one swift motion, Arik pivoted, using the momentum of Varen's own attack against him. He twisted, catching Varen's arm and pulling him forward, then delivered a precise strike to the commander's pressure point. Varen staggered, his massive form collapsing to the ground as pain shot through his body. The room went silent. Eric stood over Varen, breathing heavily but composed. He looked down at the fallen commander, then extended a hand. "That was good," Arik said quietly. "Better than I expected." Varen took a moment, then grasped Arik's hand and pulled himself to his feet. His expression was one of grudging respect, and for the first time he didn't try to hide it. "You were holding back," Varen muttered, rubbing his arm. Arik shook his head. "Not this time. You've come a long way, Commander, but there's always more to learn." Varen nodded, his pride no longer wounded, but tempered with humility. "I'll take that lesson to heart." Arik turned to the rest of the soldiers, who had watched the entire battle in stunned silence. "You've seen what happens when you combine strength with control, when you fight smart. Now it's up to you to take what you've learned here and apply it. Out there on the battlefield, there are no second chances." The Heloc soldiers exchanged glances, the weight of Arik's words settling in. They had been humbled, but they had also grown. They understood now that strength alone wasn't enough, that true warriors were the ones who could adapt, who could think on their feet. Varen stepped forward, addressing his men. "This human has taught us more than we ever expected. We came here thinking we were invincible, that our strength was enough. But today we learned a valuable lesson. Control, precision. These are just as important as power." He glanced back at Arik, his eyes filled with a newfound respect. "We owe him our thanks, and when we face our enemies again, we'll be ready." Arik smiled faintly, then gave a slight nod. "I look forward to seeing what you can do." With that, the training session came to an end. The Heloc soldiers, though bruised and battered, walked away with their heads held high. They had been challenged and they had risen to the occasion. As Arik watched them leave, Varen lingered behind. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Arik nodded. "There's always another fight, another lesson to teach." Varen extended a hand, and this time Arik took it without hesitation. You've earned our respect, Captain Draven. And if we meet again in battle, know that we'll be stronger than ever. Arik grinned, shaking the commander's hand firmly. I wouldn't have it any other way. As Varen turned to join his men, Arik stood alone in the empty hall, the echoes of the day's battles fading into the quiet. He knew his time with the Helocs had come to an end, but the impact he had left behind would linger. Another day, another lesson learned, and somewhere, out there in the vast galaxy, another challenge awaited. Arik Draven would be ready. End of story.